Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm in Washington, D.C. The Berkley Center is hosting this event together with the World Faiths Development Dialogue and the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith Communities. This is our 8th webinar that we have held since the COVID crisis erupted, and it's part of an effort to have a better understanding of what is happening in different parts of the world. Today, we're focusing on a very critical issue, which affects pretty much every country in the world now, which is associated with the crisis to a degree that some people speak about HOVID as well as COVID, that is hunger. And issues around food. To start with very few housekeeping details, this meeting is being recorded and the video will be available on the Berkley Center website not long after the event is concluded. There is a Q&A button where you are invited to write questions as we go along, and at a point during the discussion, we will be looking at those questions and seeking to answer as many as we can. We will also reflect on what we've learned today in various ways after the meeting is concluded. But let me now introduce three colleagues, friends, from different parts of the world who have remarkable insights into the global fight to end hunger and to produce food, but also who are very much affected by the current crisis. So first is the Reverend Laboulaye, who is the Secretary General or the General Secretary of the Organization of African Instituted Churches, which is a large and important group that has a long history of focusing on food issues. Lister, let me see if I can pronounce the name correctly, Nyang'anyi is with the Anglican Diocese, in Dodoma, so he's in Tanzania. Nikta is in Nairobi. And Asma Latif has multiple hats, as she will tell us shortly. She has been with Bread for the World, an American organization, for a long time, but also is now with the Alliance Against Hunger, and therefore focusing very much on the global perspectives. So we're going to have a conversation where I'm going to be asking questions. In other words, we've not invited people to give speeches or to present PowerPoints, but to give us the insights that they have from their experience. So let me start by asking Laboulaye if he could tell us, how has the COVID crisis affected you, particularly your organization, in the immediate future, and how do you see the future looking ahead? How are you seeing the issue that people are talking about as the hunger crisis?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation, and greetings to all who are participating. COVID has caused quite a number of disruptions, and the membership of the Organization of African Instituted Churches is largely in the rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa and the informal urban settlements. So, that means quite a lot when it comes to food security. The first is that COVID-19 hit at a time people were preparing for the season in many areas, which starts planting around March. So there was quite a lot of disruption in the planting. And then also in the informal urban settlements, where there's been quite a lot of loss of jobs. That means loss of livelihood. So quite a bit of uncertainty in an environment where there has been quite high levels of undernourishment. The other issue that should be mentioned is that there's been quite a lot of messaging, and most of the messaging has been public health messages. And then also messaging which are relating to big business, those who have a voice, that the smallholder farmers are back. So we are deeply affected that those who are the majority, who produce over 70% of Africa's food, seem to be silent, but they are impacted highly by COVID in relation to access to inputs, in relation to even anxiety that holds people back from getting out to work, that there is no psychosocial support for the farmers. The assumption is that they can get to their farms since maybe they are not badly affected by lockdown. So those are quite a few things, yeah.
What is your priority list, and who are you looking to for action? Both, I guess, within the church world and the religious world, but also what are you advocating for with governments to do something about this?
Number one, put agriculture at the center. Because in sub-Saharan Africa, over 70% of the population at least derives its part of its wholly or part of its livelihood from smallholder agriculture. So that is number one, prioritize agriculture. That is to the governments. To the international level, COVID is not simply a public health issue. Let's pull together and know that we are living in a world where undernourishment has been spiking up from the levels of 2015. So with the disruptions of COVID-19, we could see bigger hunger. To the international level, even the UN has already talked about hunger of biblical proportions. I think we should stop being prophets of hunger and move towards making that hunger is handled and eliminated. And then internally, in the OAIC, we are strengthening, re-envisioning. We had a vision already, but we had a pre-COVID vision. Like in Eastern Africa, already we have targeted that by end of September 2021, we'll have reached not less than 100,000 households with improved seeds and support for them to increase production. And that has a multiplier effect in the next 1 year, at the end of 2022, that there will have been about 500,000 households. So that we are going aggressively, turning around the congregation to be a center of support for production, a center of support for post-harvest management, a center of support for organizing cooperatives, a center of support for engaging local governments and national governments. That's where we are. And also, we've targeted now going beyond simply doing supporting small-scale agriculture, but making sure that it's targeted with the crops, supporting for crops. Now we've already come up together with the public research institutions. We are coming to targeting crops which have minerals like zinc. We are looking at iron because of pregnant mothers and lactating mothers. We are looking at going beyond carbohydrates because the response people turn to are cheap carbohydrates. So we are not supplying much carbohydrate. We are supplying seeds for protein, seeds for vegetables, seeds for fruits, so that we can deal with the gaps which have already been there. That's where we are.
Great. Lister, let's turn to Tanzania, but also what you're hearing from your colleagues. How are you seeing the effect of the COVID emergency from where you're sitting?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Catherine, and the fellow panelists and all other viewers who are joining this Zoom meeting. Yeah, COVID-19 has had a lot of disruptions in a number of ways. So I'll touch on a few areas where, as the Diocese of Central Tanganyika in Dodoma, we have been affected in one way or the other. So in terms of faith, yeah, we have experienced reduction in church attendance, whereby members are feeling that, okay, as they attend churches, they may contract the disease as well. So we are seeing that decline. Also, we are seeing declining in offerings. You see, as churches, we also depend on offerings from people. Now, if people are not coming to churches as expected, then that's a problem. But also there is that social thing whereby priests or pastors will have to do home visiting. But anyway, with the COVID-19, visiting one another is not the case anymore. So we see that has been very different. But also with the Diocese of Central Tanganyika, you see always there will be confirmations where the bishop will go around the diocese to do confirmations. Now, because of COVID-19, that has not been the case. So that has either been postponed or canceled altogether until at a later stage. So that's also a challenge. But also the Diocese of Central Tanganyika runs the schools. Now, for so long, students have been at home. So now, with the majority of our students coming from poor families, so there have been lack of access to learning facilities, and therefore it's expected that there will be poor performance and failures expected at schools. Now that schools are opened, but anyway, you find that now students have gone into a crash program whereby teachers are trying to rush to catch up with any time that was lost in before. And for schools, you find that they depend on collection of school fees from students. Now imagine, students have been away for so long. Therefore, even teachers were not paid for so long. And in some of our schools, we're also experiencing staff turnover, and that is a problem. But also in terms of development programs, the diocese runs a number of development programs, but with COVID-19, that has been a challenge in catching up with the time frames. So we see a lot of delay in executing action plans, and some of the activities on food security and the other activities, these have been postponed. So that is rather a challenge. But also we see a lot of reviews with the budgets, and also with the other partners, we experience budget cuts, and that is also another challenge. As a colleague in Kenya said, the COVID-19 here in Tanzania, and especially in Dodoma, happened at a time when farmers were doing planting and weeding. And therefore, farmers were not able now to access extension services. And therefore, that has been a problem. Access to inputs, that has also been a problem. So generally, it's expected that there will be hunger, despite the fact that there has been a lot of rains. But anyway, moving from one place to another, that also has been a challenge. So far, that's where we are at.
Do you have any specific areas where you think action is urgent and could help?
Yes, of course. There are a number of areas. As a religious organization, we need to promote climate smart agriculture. And therefore, for places like Dodoma, where we are facing a challenge of drought, then promotion of climate smart agriculture, that will pave a way through improving food security. But also doing food storage, that is a very important area, because like now with the COVID-19, we see that there is rise in food prices. Now, as much as possible, we are training farmers to also store food so that it is available at a time they need. But also we see that there is a need for capacity building on the nutrition aspects. You see, with the COVID-19 and with the food insecurity, our farmers here are eating anything that is available just to fill up stomachs. But anyway, that is not a nutritious food. It's not a balanced diet. And as you're aware, with the low immunity, body immunity, then and with the other reasons, then COVID-19 can be a very serious challenge. But also
So
we need,
go ahead.
Yeah, but also we need to promote off-farm activities, like small businesses. And for us here, we promote savings, whereby farmers come together, they will do their savings, and their savings accumulate, they will borrow and invest on small businesses. So as the weather goes bad, then they are able to do some level of businesses and therefore bring food on the table.
Reverend Nikta was referring to disruption of the planting and weeding as for psychological reasons because of the atmosphere of fear. Are you seeing that in Tanzania also?
Yes, exactly. That's what is happening on the ground. As I said before, COVID-19 in Dodoma happened at a time when farmers were at a critical stage of farming activities. For us here, March is just the middle of the farming season. So it happened during that time. So you can imagine how farmers were disrupted.
Well, let's turn to Asma, where you're wearing, as I said, multiple hats, but with, I think, some special perceptions and possibilities of seeing the global picture. What are you hearing and seeing on this global issue of hunger?
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me to join this panel. And yes, I'm director of Bread for the World Institute, which is an anti-hunger advocacy organization based here in Washington, D.C., and currently interim executive director of the Alliance to End Hunger, that brings together organizations across the religious spectrum, as well as with universities and secular organizations, to build a political will to end hunger. And it's really nice to see Nikta again and to hear about the impressive work that you've embarked on with OAIC. So really nice to see you again, and good to meet you too, Lister. So, Bread for the World it works both on domestic hunger issues as well as global. And when the COVID crisis hit, we were immediately engaging in the discussions with Capitol Hill and with the administration around the response. Clearly, the U.S. felt this crisis a lot sooner than parts of the developing world. And so the initial focus of the response here has been very much on the US space and making sure that our advocacy partners and we have been really making the case that hunger needed to be addressed, the domestic hunger piece needed to be addressed in the stimulus packages that were Congress approved earlier in the spring. It's been a little bit harder, to tell you the truth, to get the focus on the global crisis. And partly I think that's because the US crisis has been so challenging. And so I think there's, the attention of policymakers has very much been on addressing the crisis here. Where we have, where there has been some focus in legislation around the global side has been on the health response. And hunger has been sort of an afterthought. And so the advocacy community here is really raising awareness about how the disruptions that we're seeing here, how that's being amplified all over the world, and that the lockdowns and the shutdowns that we are experiencing here are also in place in other parts of the world, and they're having a similar impact on access to nutrition and food. There's been 820 million people were hungry prior to this crisis, and as the alarm has grown, the head of the World Food Program is really making the case that we have 135 million people right now who are in food crisis. If we don't act now, that number could double by the end of the year. So there is real urgency to act. And I think, as advocates, we're trying to make that case with US decision makers. And I think there is traction. There is another stimulus bill, and there's a lot of effort to try and make sure that funding for global food security or food security response is included in that. And that's going to happen later this summer.
So Asma, one of the questions, and as you point out, for many people, the hunger issue may not seem as obvious as the public health issues. But it also is part of this very fundamental story in the crisis, which is that it's affecting the people who are most vulnerable and most disadvantaged. And it is also revealing and making starkly apparent the deep inequalities. So I wonder, how are you seeing that in relation to what's happening in the United States? We already have a question that's pointing to the impact of poverty, obviously, which translates in the first instance into hunger on particularly vulnerable groups and its disproportionate impact. How is that a major part? And we'll turn to that at a global level, where I think it's equally true. But in the United States, what is your reaction to that question?
Yes, absolutely. This crisis has revealed the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses in the entire food system, including the huge levels of inequality, inequity in the food system. In the US, we've seen hunger at much higher rates amongst communities of color and African Americans and Latinos in particular. And partly that is because of the types of work they do. In the low-income jobs have been really hard hit by the lockdowns. And also, interestingly enough, food systems, food production is deemed essential here in the US. And yet, and the people who work in the food system are essential workers, but they're not afforded the protections they need to stay safe in this crisis. And so the anxiety that Nikta and Lista described are also felt here in the US. And we're seeing that play out, you know, in the meatpacking industry, in the agriculture sector in particular, but also in the service sector. You know, a lot of those jobs don't pay well enough for families, for people to put food on the table. And so there are real, you know, what's really interesting is this crisis has laid all of this to bear. And I think there is a lot of consciousness now and awareness about the inequities, and that also leads to potential opportunities to fix the problem.
Nikta, the picture that you paint is of this special insight, I think, that comes from the African instituted churches, which, as you say, serve people in rural areas and some of the poorest communities across the region. Where are you hearing the most about the actual immediate COVID-related hunger issues? Where are the groups most vulnerable? And I'm interested, has your organization become involved with the large numbers of refugees and internally displaced people, and how has this hunger crisis affected them?
No, it certainly cuts across, because vulnerabilities also vary. Like there are areas we are working in, and that the vulnerability comes from that they are working on small plots of land, a family of about 6 people working on half an acre. That is an area of vulnerability. We are looking at pastoralistic communities, like one somewhere in Kenya, whereby accessibility and the distance from the capitals means quite a lot. That means a lot of inequality, the geography itself. Then we are working certainly with an area in Uganda where there are refugees from southern Sudan. So that is an area of people who are uprooted, who are displaced. But we are also looking at vulnerability that cuts across, which Lister has already talked about, the whole issue of climate change. Almost, I can say, a big percentage of farmers are vulnerable because the whole issue of climate smart agriculture is still a distant factor. Then we also need to look at still vulnerability that cuts across. Before COVID, a country like Uganda, it was only 20% of the farmers who had access to certified seed. So what happens with lockdown? Excuse me. So that is the whole thing. There are multiple vulnerabilities. Then again, there are gender dimensions. For example, during the COVID-19, we relied more, we call farmer resource persons. We have a huge infrastructure. We call it social infrastructure of people, because the African independent churches rely on their processes of community building, on social capital to do what they do, because they don't have a link so much into donor resources. Little, the Organization of African Instituted Churches can have that, but the churches, no, not over 90% of them. So relying on the human resource in the congregation. So women facilitators. But it's when we got a communications people on board to say, reach out to the people who are doing the work in the field so that we know how we are doing. Both the farmer resource persons and the communications team, they are saying that they are reaching more men than women because women have less access to mobile phones. So that is an area of vulnerability of technology, which we had never looked at, even as the OAIC. Now, one, access to energy, the places where they charge their phones from, where they could access electricity, were locked. Then two, they rely, many of them rely on their spouses' phones or their children, the young people's phones. So that is an area of vulnerability that it expands. It simply makes the gender dimension of inequality wider, that by the time, unless we address it now, so if women are providing over 50% of the labor and family farms, and on family farms, it goes even to about 80% in some places. So what kind of work are they doing with agriculture without accessing extension services through mobile phones, which men are able to do, yet many of them are not even on the farm. So those are multiple dimensions of vulnerability.
Well, Nikta, one of the features of the organization that you lead and the networks is that you have insights that are often not the ones that are at the forefront, because these are not necessarily the strongest voices. But what is your communication with governments during this period? Are there regular channels of communication, and how do you see the roles of government and the elected officials? How are they responding? Are they seeking information?
Yeah, in some points, certainly, like one of the things we've done is that we know that if we want to communicate, it should be an amplified voice. So working with the interreligious councils, like in Kenya and Uganda, where the OAIC is part of the interreligious councils in those countries. So that has been the channel. Like one of the things has been, as the OAIC, giving support to our members in those organizations. Like in Uganda, we simply said, can we go ahead and deal with the whole issue of communication on agriculture? Spent time with the Secretary General, and he did it. On TV, on radio, beginning to pass messages. In Kenya, we said we needed to make sure there are some messages about farmers and farming and the vulnerabilities around it. That went through. But also for us internally, we rely on not looking, when we are working together, we say that people are alive because there is a certain resource they have. They are not docile, they are not finished. So the issue is to re-energize the hope. That's what the faith communities do, to bring back the whole issue of hope and the people being in charge. So that's one of the areas we've been working on, certainly. And we are going to strengthen that. Then the other area we are working on, we have an emerging program on social accountability. We are going to expand that it's not simply us in the capital speaking, but that the people are taking, in fact, it focuses on developing civic virtues. So wherever we are working with the farmers, we are making sure that we are developing civic virtues so that the farmers who are really hard now start raising their voices themselves. For now, we've had to do it, but now we've learned a lesson that they should have a stronger voice, better organized, better collective voice for them to influence policy. And really, for now, we have to sort out extension services and access to quality seeds. Yeah.
Now, in one of the questions that's coming in is asking specifically for you to speak to food democracy. So I don't know if this is something that you're familiar with, but that's what the question is: the need to work together with environmental democracy and sustainable agriculture in Africa.
Oh, certainly. That's the whole issue. One of the things we are looking at is in the OAIC, looking because it's a more holistic understanding of society. Like one of the issues in the new strategy, which is starting 2020, we delayed to release it. It was supposed to come out, but with the COVID, we've had to transform it. We are talking about human flourishing, mm-hmm. and environment and ecological harmony. So that flourishing is not to the detriment of ecological harmony. Certainly, then also we know that quite well that food security will not simply come from farmers working hard.
Mhm.
It is the whole issue of it being a political agenda on which farmers drop their vote in relation to how they have been served by their political leaders.
And one of the
National
interesting
levels.
questions
Yeah.
is how the COVID crisis will either advance or interfere with that. I guess that's very much on our minds. Lister, can you address some of these same questions we're wrestling with? One is, where do you see the greatest vulnerability, and how is the relationship with governments, that the Anglican Communion as a whole or the interreligious is mobilizing essentially to try to address these questions?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Catherine, for bringing forward this question on vulnerabilities. So for us as Diocese of Central Tanganyika, we are also doing quite a lot to make sure that with the small resources that we are having, we are able to reach the most needy communities and therefore the most vulnerable communities. For instance, with the COVID-19, we, as the Diocese of Central Tanganyika, we have been able to also reach out to deaf people. Now, with the deaf people, at a time when we were doing public announcements, just to bring awareness into the communities with the regard to COVID-19. So we were also able to meet with the deaf people. And they were very much thankful because for them, information was lacking. And as an organization, we also have a department that deals with the deaf. So we have people within the diocese with the skills and experiences in sign language interpretation. So as we go out for community mobilizations, we also go out with them, and therefore they are meeting these people. And as they speak, these deaf people are saying they are very much appreciating at least to be reached with the with the COVID-19 messages, which otherwise other stakeholders have not been able to reach them simply because of that language barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we also reach out to blind people and albinos. Within the diocese, we have a school for albinos and the blind, and therefore we're also able to reach out to them. As you are aware, with the COVID-19, these people can be at a very risky situation because they are not seeing, so they can touch anything, and therefore contamination can be just huge. So that is also an area that we are focusing. But also we understand that our clergy and faith leaders, these are very important people, and they're at risk because they meet with a lot of people during Sunday services, and therefore that one is also a source of contamination. Therefore, we need to target them. But also, as with COVID-19, it has been part of the sermon. So messages are also brought out, and therefore people are listening to the sermon as part of it. Yeah. But
Is
also
there
the other thing.
coordination with governments on this issue of messages to make sure that it's reaching, that there's a two-way communication with people who are the most vulnerable? You've highlighted some very important groups, the people who are blind, deaf, the albinos, among others.
Yes, you are with the COVID-19. there has been a lot of misinformation, and there have been a lot of exaggeration around COVID-19. Therefore, the government of Tanzania has been very serious on making sure that they have streamlined the means of communication and the messages that go out. Yeah, for instance, any organization that is doing training on COVID-19 as well as on public announcements, they have got to use messages that have been developed by the Ministry of Health, so that what goes out is uniform throughout the country. And that one also now reduces that challenge of everybody coming in with a different message and therefore raising a panic within the community. So the government has been very serious on that, and we are happy that it is happening, and therefore that has reduced quite a lot of panic within with the communities.
I'm interested also, Nikta raised the very interesting question that a lot of women don't have reliable access to mobile phones, which have become so critical in so many parts of Africa. Is that something you're hearing also?
Yes, that's also something that is happening. Yeah, you find that women within a household, in one way or another, there may be a phone, but anyway, that phone, you do not know exactly who is owning that phone, that phone at any particular time. So that is also a challenge. It's kind of shared with all members within the household, and with the power relations, that is with the African culture. You find that the woman does not necessarily access to a phone at any time they need. But anyway, that is also happening.
Thank you. Asma, I was listening to a meeting this morning with David Beasley, former governor here, obviously very astutely alert to political issues, with a passionate description of the global issues of hunger and the risk of mass starvation. I'm interested in how you see the advocacy around that issue at this difficult time. You commented on it before, but maybe you could amplify a bit where that kind of issue stands and where you might see some crunch points where people might focus more sharply.
So I think there's growing awareness. As I said, it's been hard to get that focus on hunger. Specifically, I think David Beasley's been really eloquent and out there making the case. And the Secretary General of the United Nations also recently issued a policy brief on food security and nutrition in the COVID crisis. And so there is, there will be reports coming up in the next few months. The Lancet series is also, the Lancet is going to have a piece on COVID and nutrition. So what has been sort of anecdotal evidence, there's beginning to be an effort to really quantify the impact. And I do see there are several key moments. I think as the world is thinking about the immediate crisis, really lifting up the importance of nutrition. Both Nikta and Lister have talked about the critical importance of ensuring dietary diversity, making sure that this short-term crisis, health crisis, does not lead to really a long-term legacy of, especially for children in that early period, in infants and young children in that 1,000-day window. Hunger at this stage and malnutrition at this stage will have lifelong consequences for their physical cognitive development that would impact their health, their earning ability, their education ability down the road. So we really need to make sure that in the crisis response that we are making sure that that the food that's being delivered, the emergency humanitarian assistance is prioritizing nutrition. And then we have to make sure that the health systems are not disrupted, because the COVID crisis is taking up a lot of resources in the health system. And so things that would have been, the health system would have been dealing with on a day-to-day basis are being disrupted as the need from the COVID crisis is taking over. And so, there's a risk that you won't catch malnutrition in babies and in pregnant women in a timely way. And so we need to make sure that health systems continue to function and deliver really important nutrition services, even in this time of crisis. And I think, as Nikta and Lister mentioned, we have to support smallholder farmers, make sure that they have access to adequate seeds and are being able to produce the diversity of foods that are needed for a nutritious diet. And then thinking about, the longer term and opportunities as the world starts to think about, you've probably seen the hashtag of building back better, or as David Nabarro said the other day at our Hunger Report launch, we should stop talking about building back better, because back was not good enough, especially in terms of nutrition and health. And the food system was clearly broken. So what we need is to leap forward better. And so how do we engage that conversation? I think advocates need to start thinking now about the recovery plans. This crisis is not going away anytime soon. The economic impact will take years. And so there is an opportunity to really put in place strategies and programs that are addressing the vulnerabilities that Nikta and Lister mentioned, and really build back so that you're putting people's health, and the planet at the center of the food system moving forward. And so, next year, the Secretary General will host the Food Systems Summit. I think that's a huge opportunity for all of us all over the world to really engage with our policymakers, governments, and make the case that the food system needs to be delivering far better and addressing some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities and inequities that we've seen through this crisis.
Well, it's fascinating, I think, that there's some very strong common themes that link the way that the issue is presented in the United States and the way that it's presented in Eastern Africa. Some of the things that I think are very actionable that we really need to think about more coming out of this are where some of the information gaps are. That there seem to be information gaps, also in a sense awareness gaps, but there also is the interconnectedness of all these issues. That you start talking about food and you talk about maternal health and health systems, and you are talking about environmental challenges and changing climate patterns, and schools and the impact on children, and the fact that the schools are closed and the impact that has on nutrition and on health. So clearly that's one of the features of this crisis, is that it affects everyone, but it also links so many of these different issues. You have focused on the issue that I'm hoping we can talk about in the last part of this, and I'll turn to each of you. With this challenge, I'm interested, both Nikta and Lister speak of clearly important ongoing programs and initiatives. In other words, you don't need to reinvent everything. You have important programs that are going on already. And I think, Asma, you would say the same. Pretty much everywhere, including in the United States. It isn't that there is a need to reinvent, but there is an opportunity to rethink and to reimagine. And that is a political issue, but it's also a question of priorities and of putting your finger on where it is. So perhaps each of you could think about that, both with a couple of the questions have focused on this political lens. In other words, where religion and politics, how do they come together? It is the prophetic voice. It is seeing beyond the technocratic issues into the moral issues, but also into some of the visions that others might not have. So if I could challenge each of you in the last, we now have 10 minutes only, to be prophetic and to sort of give us your list, your wish of what you would do if you could wave your magic wand, or if you could speak the truth to power. So Nikta, that's your challenge.
Thank you. The very first thing is that Africa's hunger and poverty is a scandal. Mm-hmm. It is hunger and poverty in the midst of plenty. That is a scandal to political mm-hmm. and to religious leadership. 2, Africa's hunger and poverty is not a shame to the poor and the hungry. It's a shame to us, the leaders. If we looked at it that way, we shall be able to go. And then prophetically, it is important for us to know that it's possible to end hunger. We start from such a vision. Rather than talking about what we don't want, we are saying it is possible. We've seen it at household level. When you target a household that has been in dire need, food insecurity, and you realize that in 1 year, they're on the other side simply changing their farming practices, caring about the soil health, caring about what they plant. When they are planting, is there a pregnant mother, a lactating mother, is there an elder? So that when you are talking about food, it's not simply just food, but for everybody. So I think and then finally, the faith communities will have to be much more prophetic in engagement. So that we go beyond caring, reconciling, healing what has been broken, so that we move to the dismantling of the foundations on which hunger and poverty and inequality are built. And we need to identify the stone and the concrete that form what hunger and poverty is, and begin to dismantle them. Otherwise, we seem to be having been building on the same foundations as we care, as we support. So we need a bold vision into the future with the COVID now. And it's a great opportunity. We need a bold vision to proclaim and work for an Africa without hunger.
Excellent. That was a hard act to follow, but Lister, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. From the Tanzania perspective, and Dodoma in particular, where I'm speaking from, I think that going forward, this is what we need to do. One, for us, food insecurity is the main agenda here. But also drought is still a very serious challenge. Therefore, we have got to change. Farmers have got to change their farming practices. And as a faith-based organization, we are promoting conservation agriculture, as I said before. Therefore, to make use of the small amount of rains that we are getting, so that these can be used efficiently for crop production. The other thing is that traditionally here, during times of harvest, you find that farmers lose a lot of grain to insects on storage, but also to just use grain on other items, because that's the only source of money that they can convert into other uses. Therefore, doing much of grain storage is very important in this area. But nutrition, as I said before, nutrition is also very important during this time when there is plenty of foodstuffs, because for us here is a harvesting period. So processing of these foods into forms that can still preserve nutrients so that these households and families can consume at a time of food shortage, then that is of paramount importance. But we also need to invest on capacity building, mainly to do with the disaster preparedness and mitigation. That is an area where we also need to prepare. But also adaptive management is one area. As organizations, we need to change as the situations change. Otherwise, we need to cope with the changing situation. But also coordinating with the governments, coordinating with the other stakeholders is very important. And prioritization is equally important because resources are limited. So as my colleague in Kenya said, I see a bright future regarding COVID-19 if we can play our part as a faith-based organization.
Well, you've laid out quite a set of challenges. So Asma, I'll turn to you last. And there is a question here that also is a challenge. Should Bread for the World be relocated outside the US? So your prophetic voice for us all.
Well, I would argue that NICTA's Organization for African Instituted Churches is sort of functioning like a Bread for the World outside the United States. So, and maybe we can talk about that another time. But in terms of, 5 years ago, the world agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals, including a goal to end hunger. And that set of goals really put people and the planet at the center. And ever since then, we've seen increases in hunger almost every year since we agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm. That should have been a wake-up call, and I think that it was. The UN organizations were raising the alarm about it, and so were we in this space. But I think COVID has gotten the attention. We cannot waste this moment where the world has really, every single person in the world is going through this experience together. And we have all recognized that our fates are joined, and that the systems that we rely on are really fragile. And we have to really think about how to strengthen those systems together as a global community. We have to be smarter about every dollar that we invest. We've got 10 years left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and to end hunger. Every single dollar we invest needs to be contributing to human health and improving our access to nutritious, healthy diets, and making sure that we don't do all of this at the expense of the planet. There are strong economic arguments to be made for this, but these are huge moral arguments as well. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you all. That was very inspirational. And I think it leaves us with long agendas. Asma, you said that our fates are joined, but I also thought I heard our faiths are joined, which I think is is a part of the challenge. So we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank you all so much for the rich experience. There's so much to build on, I think, is one of the lessons that comes through this. And then this question of the interconnectedness, and also this sense of the scandal and the shame of some of these issues. The fact that in today's world, we are talking not only about discomfort, but about starvation and about massive, massive issues of hunger that are aggravated by the situation we face today. So we'll bring this to a close with, again, many thanks to all of you. And I think we have only started a conversation that I hope we can continue. So good afternoon, good evening.